This is Eitan Weinstein.
And I'm Naor Menninger, and you're listening to Two Nice Jewish Boys.
If there's one place on earth where geopolitics not only makes for good dinner conversation, but is also an everyday concern for every citizen, it's the Middle East. Today, we'll dive into the captivating realm of Middle East geopolitics, where history is being reshaped by intricate negotiations. Israel and Saudi Arabia, former foes, now pursue historic peace, yet that shadows loom as nuclear reactors emerge on Saudi soil. Amidst Lebanon's fragility, Hezbollah's audacious dance with Israel adds even more tension, and as Iran navigates behind the scenes, orchestrating both regional turmoil and negotiations with President Biden for a pivotal nuclear deal, the region hangs in a delicate balance. To shed light on these complex dynamics and the broader forces at play, we obviously couldn't rely on ourselves. So we are honored to have Dr. Raphael BenLevi with us today, a distinguished authority in international relations and political science. Dr. BenLevi serves as the director of the Churchill Program for Strategy, Statecraft, and Security at the Argaman Institute, and is a research fellow at the Misgav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy. Drawing from an extensive background in IDF Intelligence and affiliations with esteemed institutions such as Georgetown University, he brings profound insights to the intricate tapestry of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Notably, his contributions extend to his upcoming book entitled Cultures of Counterproliferation, the Making of U.S. and Israel Policy on the Iranian Nuclear Program, with a scholarly journey culminating in a PhD from Bar-Ilan University, an MA from Reichman University, and a Bachelor's of Science from the Technion. Dr. BenLevi's expertise serves as a guiding beacon in our pursuit of understanding these critical dynamics, so we are super thrilled to be joined by him today. Thank you so much. How are you?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here.
So, where do we start? What's changed in geopolitics, I'd say, in the last 50 to 100 years?
Oh,
What's
okay.
different?
That's a pretty broad context. That's a good one.
Well, the past 5,000 years.
Yeah.
That's changed.
I would focus mainly on, let's say, compare our era to the Cold War and the end of the Cold War, right? So post World War II, we were in the Cold War, and we called that a bipolar system. Why? Because we had two great powers that were competing with each other over influence, essentially on every area in the world, right? And they were of more or less comparable extent of power, whether militarily or economically, and as far as geographic resources and others, right? And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, we entered what people have called the unipolar moment, meaning that there's only one great power in the world, and no other state power comes even close to that level of power, and that's the United States, right? And this was very clear throughout the 1990s. Let's say that was the case, and it may be even still clear during the 2000s. But in the last 10 years or so, it's starting to be clear that we are moving away from a structure of unipolarity toward a structure again of bipolarity, meaning that there is at least one other great power in the world who is comparable or in the same category as the United States, and it wants and seeks to challenge U.S. dominance in geographically, militarily, in international institutions, regionally, and that power is obviously the People's Republic of China.
And I mean, what was going on with China in the 90s and 2000s? Where were they, and what changed that made them all of a sudden relevant?
Right. Okay. So in order to understand that, we got to talk briefly about where China was during the Cold War. Let's say so like in between World War I and World War II, there was essentially a civil war within China between who would take over the country, what kind of country it would be after the fall of the kingdom of the Kesserut. And this was between, on the one hand, the communists, right, in the 1920s, 1930s, and the nationalists, you might call them, the Kuomintang. All right. And in 1948, as it turns out, what essentially happened is that the Kuomintang, the nationalist faction, escaped, and essentially they were overrun by the communists, and they escaped and they went to the island of Taiwan. All right, and they essentially took along with themselves, they claim the mantle as being the real China. Like, will the real China please stand up? So two people are going to stand up. Taiwan is going to stand up, and the People's Republic of China, which was later founded after the nationalists escaped, founded by Mao Zedong, right? And since then, China, mainland China, has been Communist China. It's the People's Republic of China, run by the CCP, the Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party. Okay. They also claim that they're the real China, right? And so this is what the source of this big issue between China and Taiwan, right? Because they both claim the mantle of the same identity, right? And so obviously China wound up is more recognized as the real China just because of the scale. There's just a lot more of them, and they sit on the mainland, which is historical China. But the very identity of Beijing, of the real China, is challenged by the fact that there exists this country called Taiwan, and they claim a mantle of the legitimacy of the 3,000-year-old political tradition of China.
They say that Taiwan says that the communist China is not really China and it's fake China.
It's the illegitimate China.
Why don't they call themselves China?
Well, they're the Republic of China. They do that's what
Chinese Republic of Taiwan.
Taiwan is really the Republic of China, and what we call China is the People's Republic of China.
Taiwan is officially called the Republic of China.
Yeah, well, that's what they want to be called. I mean, that's what they are officially called.
Well,
they don't want to call it because
they don't want to upset
the PRC's bullying. Yeah, because the PRC says no, you don't call them China. Okay, right. We call them Taipei, right? They don't even want to call them.
So they're actually trying to call themselves China.
Yeah, actually, it's worth noting that for the first 50s, 60s, Taiwan sat at the Chinese seat of the UN Security Council, right? There's 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, so one of them is China, right? And so even after they escaped for Taiwan for at least 2 decades, they were the officially recognized China because they were called the Free China. This is how in the Cold War talk they were called Free China as opposed to Red China, right? And it was only in the 1970s under Kissinger Nixon, where the U.S. made a shift where they said, we're fighting against the Soviets, right? And their natural allies, at least ideologically, are the communists, the Chinese communists. And what we need to do is separate them, right? And how are we going to separate them? By bringing China into our orbit, right? And so for strong geopolitical reasons, in order to strengthen their hand against the Soviets, they said, we're going to do a switch. Even though we don't like the Maoist Red China people, they're not as powerful. They're not as big of a threat as Soviet Russia is. So we're going to do a switch, and we're going to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China and accept them as the real China.
So how did
That's
America...
how we got the light rail.
No, we didn't even get there yet. I'm sorry, I didn't even get there yet.
No, that's not the... Okay. That was the context.
Okay, but how did America let it happen under their nose?
Yeah.
For China, made it happen. Apparently,
they made it happen. Yeah, but for China to become so powerful,
right.
yeah. How
did
so
they really did. They really did in some ways help in create the monster, quote unquote, that's become the PRC. That's because so. I can't go into too much, but you have to understand when Mao came to power and they tried to establish real communism, right? The communism have never been challenged, right? Except for in Russia and China and a lot of other places. They established real communism and they ruined the entire country, right? And millions of people in the 50s, right? And they all these euphemisms like the Great Leap Forward, right? They were going to jump forward, but what they did was devastate their agriculture and their society. And so that they wind up paying a price for that over
Tens
the 50s.
Of millions of people
died of starvation.
There's the cultural...
And then in the 60s, they had the Cultural Revolution because people weren't so happy about what happened in the 50s. And so anyone anyone who started who dared to call into question what Mao's policies were, they needed to be they needed to purify the party of anyone who thought like that, and that became the Cultural Revolution, where then they went and then actively killed another few million people who had even called into question whether that was his policy. But by the end of the 70s and the early 80s, then they really had enough, and Mao died by then, and so the people in the party understood that their changes need to happen. All right, so Deng Xiaoping was the new leader who emerged, and they essentially decided to open up the economy. Meaning, he said we need to move away from a really no private property and everything being communally shared and all that. We need to move away from that and allow some sort of level of private industry. And,
just keep the good part, the authoritative, violent government,
right?
But
so,
no socialist.
Right. So they still pay lip service to Marxism, and Marx is still his portrait is still hanging really, really big at the conventions and all that. And in many ways, they're still Marxists, but I think in more accurate, they're more Leninists, right? Because there's theoretical Marxism, and then just Leninism, which is the political aspect of how to take over control and run an authoritarian regime, right? And so that they've definitely maintained, right? But in the 80s, they opened up their economy in many ways, and that's what started leading to their economic jump forward, the real jump forward economically, which we saw in the 80s and 90s. So in the US at the time, the idea was that if we allow China and encourage China to open up economically, eventually this will lead toward political liberalization as well. Meaning political liberalized economics are going to eventually somehow or another lead to democratization and liberal politics.
Kind of the similar argument to what goes on here in Israel around the Palestinians, right? Like we need to give them more economic freedom, and that will bring about some kind of
Ironically, this is some way it's even itself a Marxist argument that's saying that ideas follow the economic structure, right? Instead of having their own worth, that their ideas have their own value, that they are the real influencers long term in history and in politics. They say no, it's all the economic structure. So you change the economic structure, and then you'll change the ideas, right? So in some ways, it's still within the
artificially
Marxist ideas.
Kissinger tried to change Marxism using a Marxist.
So that part of it, I don't know, if the belief that they're going to eventually open up is something I would attribute to Kissinger, right? Kissinger was just saying we have a stronger power that's a real threat, which is Soviet Russia, and we have a weaker power. So we need to separate them, and in order to deal with the Soviets.
I see.
Right, but that sort of took hold in the American thinking and discourse on it.
So before we get into what all of this has to do with Israel and the Middle East, can you give us a rundown real quick of like where it stands today, China versus the U.S., like militarily, geopolitically, like what
who would win? Who would win in the war, the big war?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question. For the most part, you could still say that the U.S. still leads the world by far. Let's say just military expenditures. They still invest more than about 10 times as much. About equal amount of the next 10 countries after them. Yeah. Right. As far as overall military spending. So that's one way of measuring it, although it's not really accurate because they spend a lot on wages, which the Chinese military doesn't. They also are more at the forefront of technology, even though China has been stealing all of their best technologies and then reverse engineering them. And so they're sort of catching up, but they're always a few steps behind. So the real technological edge is still in favor of the U.S., right? And the U.S. has the ability to create large amounts of forces to the other side of the world using their aircraft carriers, which only the U.S. has like 10 aircraft carriers, which is essentially like a military base, and the ability to then forward and move and deploy, they call it amphibious forces. They can then land on the ocean and then invade an actual territory. No other country has that ability. Definitely not on that scale. China has like one aircraft carrier, one or two that they launched in the last little while, and a few helicopter carriers, and they're not the same. They're not the same scale. Mm-hmm. But it's not just an overall. You can't just look at the overall balance of power. You also have to look at the balance of wills and where where such a war would be played out. And it would be playing out in China's backyard. And so China doesn't have to move all of its forces to actually threaten the U.S. homeland in order to have a serious war and to be a serious challenger in its own backyard.
Which is the South China Sea, like that's the main battleground.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is officially committed to the security of a number of states in the region, right? It has formal U.S. treaties with South Korea, Japan, Philippines.
Taiwan.
No, so Taiwan, it doesn't have a formal treaty with. It has a vague commitment, a vague commitment to saying China.
But huge technological interest.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of interest.
Which
so, yeah,
maybe is
absolutely.
even stronger than a pact.
Yeah, I would say
Right?
I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, that at the end of the day, a pact is a declaration. A pact is a declaration, and so yeah, it has an effect.
But strategic.
But when push comes to shove, some countries have not really lived up to their declarations, right? But they are going to live up. You might bank on them living up to their interests.
Yeah.
Right.
And that interest is the fact that Taiwan is the main producer of semiconductors.
Yeah, that's one direct interest. Most of the people, this is an argument, this is debated in the U.S. And it's funny, I'm telling our American audience about what's debated in the U.S. But we'll get to the Middle East, how all this influences the Middle East.
It's funny because
too.
you're a Canadian.
Yeah, right. So so that's a more immediate interest. But what people are arguing, and this is debated in the U.S. When push comes to shove, should the U.S. really be going to war over Taiwan, right? And so the people that argue that they should, which is still more or less the consensus, say that if we don't stand up to Taiwan, then our entire global strategy is going to fall apart, because then Japan, South Korea, no one's going to rely on us anymore. Right. Even though we didn't sign our name on the Pact with Taiwan, everyone understands that we've essentially declared that we're going to support Taiwan if China tries to invade them. So if they fail to do that, then no one's going to rely on the U.S. anymore.
But something doesn't sit well with me with this comparison to the Cold War, because in the Cold War there was the Iron Curtain, the Iron Curtain, and here with China and America, they are so intertwined with each other, so deeply dependent on each other. Like China is heavily invested in debt in America, or vice versa. So America is in debt, yes, but China also invested in American companies, and et cetera. So I'm not sure they can even technically go to war in that, no? Yeah,
so that is a big difference, right? The amount of economic integration between the two countries. Let's say what is more similar, though, is the desire to become dominant in various parts of the globe. Right, so China's immediate strategy is to make itself the dominant power in East Asia, right? But its broader strategy, it's looking at, in the terms of decades, is to essentially replace the United States as the central power in all aspects of global politics. And that includes becoming dominant over all of Eurasia, like the overall landmass that's not the Western Hemisphere. And that includes, Europe, Southern Asia, Middle East, Africa, Europe, and international institutions and economic institutions, and all of that. That's really what the Chinese Communist Party is aiming at, right? So in that sense, it's still bringing it into a direct confrontation with the United States, right? And just it might initially, militarily, the flashpoint would be in South Asia, but the overall strategic competition is that. It's over that.
Mm-hmm. So what is this, other than the light rail? What does this have to do with Israel? Right.
Okay. So that's great. So we just mentioned the fact that China wants to become more dominant over all of Eurasia. Well, the Middle East is part of that, right? It's actually a very significant part of that, because Israel and the broader Middle East sits at the crossroads between the continents, right? And it's funny, you said 5,000 years, right? So Israel really has had the same strategic sort of conundrum, challenge, since its previous instantiations as a political entity in the First and Second Temple, right? Because great powers are interested in this area of the world, right? Because if you want to control the Middle East, then you want to control up to the Mediterranean. If you're in ancient Egypt, then you want to have your buffer zone coming into the Levant, what they call this region, right? And if you're Rome, you want to be able to control the entire Mediterranean basin. And the way to move forces from Rome to the southern end, if you're not going to send them over in boats, is also to control this area of the world. So everyone wants a piece of this world, of this region. It's sitting right at the center of global geopolitics. If you have a non-Western oriented or non-American oriented worldview, right? Which is where the most of people are, which is, difficult and sometimes for Americans to understand because New York is the center of the world in that worldview. But as far as a lot of other things, here is the center of the world.
So how should Israel? I mean, personally, when I hear about Israeli-Chinese relations, as a former, I'm still American by citizenship, but as former person who grew up in the States and lives in the States, and with that American identity in me, it's like it kind of makes me feel squeamish. Mm-hmm. The idea that Israel has ties with such a foul, actor, global actor, and a communist power that does so much evil, and we all know about it. But where does that put us on, in geopolitics? Like, from your point of view, should we be playing more strategically and be careful and tread lightly and kind of have
play
our
on both
feet,
fields.
dip our toes in both waters, or should we be taking more of an ideological stance against authoritarianism?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would put it this way. First of all, before we ask, about Israel's connections with China, communist China, right? Whatever connections that Israel has, the U.S. has vastly more deep and more integrated connections with the foul country of communist China, right? Whether it's economically or politically or populations that study with each other, or the United States is fully penetrated by the Communist Party in many different dimensions, right? And as far as people, also militarily, people worry about Israel shouldn't be selling to China some dual-use technologies that might be used against American, forces if they were to have this battle over Taiwan, and that's absolutely true. But if the U.S. forces are going to be attacked by dual-use technology originating in the West, it's going to be their own dual-use technologies that they're selling to China in a vastly larger scale than anything Israel's doing. But I don't think Israel could possibly consider the China as as an alternative great power supporter to the United States. That kind of world, I wouldn't want to live in that world. Like, I wouldn't want that world to come about. That would be very, dark scenario for the world, for Israel, for everyone, right? So ideologically, I think Israel does have a very clear stance on that, and I would definitely support that stance.
So do we have that kind of stance? Like, what do we do?
Well, I think that the people in charge understand that China is not really a viable alternative, and no one wants to have to abandon the United States as a great power supporter and move to a China.
Do you think it's so clear? I mean, I don't know, maybe the current powers that be, but culturally, we're not so. I feel like there aren't that many people who view China in the same way that you're right that America probably is much more integrated, but right. I feel like maybe the average American still sees China as like the commies, and in Israel it's like that's not so bad because we still have kibbutzim. You know what I mean?
Right. I think it's an interesting point. I would put it this way. I think in Israel the attitude towards China is more of apathy. I don't know if it's necessarily because of our socialist hangover, which in the general political culture is still hangs around. Hopefully we'll get over it in the coming decades. I don't know if it's necessarily that, though. I don't think people really perceive China as a communist country. They perceive it as a great power who is at least not anti-Israel. Right? This is a breath of fresh air. Like most of the external powers, if they're not the United States, then we have to deal with this, we don't really like you. We'd rather you didn't exist. We won't say it, but we sort of, we support your greatest enemies, and the fact that China doesn't really have a anti-Semitic, anti-Israel issue bone to pick with us is just refreshing.
But didn't they just sign a huge deal with Iran?
That's what I wanted to say. It's not about they don't. I feel like it's not about they don't have something against us, and more that they don't care about the Palestinians.
Okay, yeah, it goes
Right?
together. I would say it
Yeah,
goes
but
together.
that's the holy grail. Like that they don't
Mhm.
care about the Palestinians. Yeah, they can do a deal with Iran as long as they don't care about
No,
the Palestinians.
I don't know about that. Also, I want to separate when we're trying to analyze the general Israeli attitude of like the public attitude toward China, and then these other latest developments and strategic calculations, right? So I'm saying that in the like Israeli public perception, China is like this place where you buy stuff from, and it's far away, and they don't hate us, and they're kind of foreign and kind of cool, right? They're not communist in the Israeli public perception. They're just sort of weird and big and take up a large part of the population of the world, and they sell stuff for cheap, right? But strategically though, I think it's understood in the system, in the Israeli security establishment and in the political echelon, that we do need to be cautious over what we sell and our own exposure in Israeli high tech, or the Israeli high tech / military high tech. That we need to be careful about that, not in order to not undermine our American friends, and in order to not expose our own new technologies that we are the source of to be stolen by the CCP as well, right? And so in the recent years, and this is something only in the past few years that's become more formulated and more formalized, that Israel is actually very careful now about what it's going to cooperate with China and what it's not going to cooperate with.
What does that cooperation look like? Like historically, and also in the last couple of years, like you've mentioned, like what kind of what is China's level of investment here in high tech? What kind of cooperation is there militarily?
Yeah, well, overall, again, it's a lot less than most of the rest of the West. The Israel-China relations is really from the 1990s onward, and even more so in the last decade or so. So China is part of its grand strategy is to be able to go and offer various countries that they can do big infrastructure projects, right? That will be for your own benefit, right? And we can offer a better price than most of the competitors, right? And so countries that are not careful and they can't fund that on their own, then they're also exposed to Chinese the CCP's ability to then offer them loans with difficult repayments that then put collateral various strategic assets of the country, right? In some ways, they've sort of, once the country they make them a good offer. This is what happened in Sri Lanka, right? So the Chinese make them a really good offer that will develop all of these things and railroads and buildings and tunnels and all that and communications infrastructure, and we'll offer you the financing as well under certain terms. But if you don't pay it back, then we get to establish military bases, and we own this and we own that, and we own you, right? And so that's what they do for a lot of countries. Now Israel is not in that position because it's relatively economic stable and not stupid enough to do that.
They literally write that. They say we'll be.
No, they won't write we'll own you. But there's various conditions.
We can establish a military base.
Yeah. I mean, we own we retake ownership of the infrastructure in certain parts.
And in order to take ownership,
if you can't
we
pay
need
us
to
back.
establish a military base.
Or whatever. If you can't pay us back, and we get to put whatever we want in those bases.
Okay.
Right? Or other various collaterals that wind up making the country very beholden to the preferences of the CCP. Right? But Israel's not in that position. Israel's not going to do that because economically it's not Sri Lanka and it's not other countries in Africa, right? And it knows how to make deals in a way that's not going to do that.
2008 in Israel, or worse in 1929 in
we could, but first of all, Israel's not making those kinds of agreements even with its big infrastructure projects. It's not opening itself to
the
that.
Chinese port in Haifa, they do have some kind of autonomy there, no?
I don't want to go into details. Also, I don't know all the details because I don't know the details of every single thing.
Are you afraid to get taken down by a...
He doesn't sound like someone who's afraid to... of China.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm joking, just a side note. Sure. When this port was built and I was doing a political race in Haifa in 2018, someone I worked with said that people are afraid to talk about the port because people are afraid of China.
Perhaps. I can tell you why the people that I know that know a little bit more about it than I do say, and that's that this has become a way blown out of proportion political issue more than it is an actual technical issue, right? And so I mean, if it was that Chinese really controlled all the different all the communications there, and they had access to the radars and the other they were able to spy on the U.S. Fifth Fleet or the U.S. fleet in the Mediterranean, fifth or sixth, And then, there might be something to it. But most of them say this is not true. This is not how we've built it. We've constructed it in a way that doesn't actually expose China to the secrets. There's firewalls. There's protections in place against this. And it really just became this big political symbol a few years ago. And Secretary of State Pompeo was in Israel, and it sort of blew up on the headlines. Mm-hmm. But that's not really the issue, right? The issue is more high-tech companies, investments from high-tech companies that are being invested in by giant Chinese high-tech companies,
like Playtika, for example,
right,
SoftBank,
right, and then that exposes them. They have to that'll exposes their secrets and their technical secrets to China that can then take them. And you have to understand there is no
SoftBank
real.
Isn't Japanese?
No, I think SoftBank is a big Chinese. No,
Yes, I don't know.
SoftBank, I think, were invested in eToro. They're big Chinese.
Okay.
You have to understand, even though China opened up its economy and it nominally has a private industry and all that, there is no real private, independent companies in China, right? They are all beholden to the CCP. All of the people that manage them are part of the party.
Yeah.
They are all penetrated by Chinese intelligence, and they're essentially forced to cooperate and pass on information to Chinese intelligence.
For example, there is one industry. Here's a riddle for you, master. There is an industry that is completely ruled by China, by Chinese industry. And it's deeply, like it's controlling, it's everywhere in the Western world. Everywhere. Can you guess it?
Chinese food.
Oh, no. Drones. Drones, because DJI, the drone company, it is the only drone company. Like there are other drone companies, but nobody buys drones from another company. They are completely homogeneous in the drone industry. Big drones, industrial drones, and also hobby drones. Only DJI, and it's a Chinese company. And of course, the intelligence is like incredible. Right? Because people fly it all over the place. It all goes through the app, which isn't even in the app store. You need to download it
from the Chinese.
From DJI. It's not in the app store.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's exactly my point. Right. So that's the real exposure, the real issue, not the tunnel through Har Carmel and Haifa or other sort of low tech big projects. Right, but that's a great point, because that's demonstrative of Chinese penetration into the Middle East, because China is selling drones to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, and that's one of their main. That's their first step into Middle East arms. Right, up until now, over the past 20 years, everyone used to say China only wants to trade with Middle East countries. It's happy with U.S. controlling the security, U.S. controlling the security of the Persian Gulf. The U.S. provides stability. China enjoys this by having a flow of energy coming out through the Persian Gulf, which it desperately needs, and it only wants to trade with people. But that was true maybe in the 90s and 2010s. But recently, now it's clear that China wants to be and seeks to be more influential, both militarily, strategically. What we saw with the deal, the strategic cooperation agreement with Iran 2 years ago, the moderating the renewal of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, right, and selling arms and bases in Djibouti and other places.
And one last thing I have to ask you, because we had a guest a few months ago, an analyst, an economist, David Wu, and he said that in his opinion, the Ukraine-Russia war is a proxy war. So Ukraine is obviously proxy of America. That's easy to prove. But he said, look, Russia is a proxy of China. And it's more an indirect proxy. But when you think about it, like China is funding Iran. And Iran is selling the weapons to Russia. So there is a kind of a connection there.
I mean, yeah, you could say that. I don't know, proxies really characterizes a relationship in the most accurate way, but definitely one of the results of the war, the Russia-Ukraine war, is that it sort of is exposed that Russia as not quite as powerful as maybe it seemed to be, at least militarily, and it has increased its dependence on China. Right, because of the sanctions that the West has put under it, so it needs to sell its oil and its resources somewhere. Now it's selling it to East Asia and selling it to China, but China is the powerful is the stronger figure in this relationship here, right? So this is one of the big
it also
sort of
probably
changes.
it probably also gained geopolitical confidence in quotes, right? Because it had this, quote unquote, big scary bear on its northern front, but really it turns out it's not that big and not that scary.
Yeah, and now a lot more dependent on its cooperation with China itself.
Yeah.
And so that's definitely so I wouldn't go so far as a proxy, but there's definitely that dynamic. It's also changed the dynamic with Iran, vis-a-vis Iran, where, let's say, if 10, 15 years ago, the U.S. started putting sanctions on Iran in order to, disrupt its, make it pay for its nuclear program, it needed the cooperation of Russia and China, at least needed the cooperation to get the broad UN Security Council sanctioned sanctions, right? There are some unilateral sanctions they can do either way, right? And maybe those are some are more important. But a big part of that was cooperation of Russia and China, right? So, but today that's not going to happen. Russia at the time played this sort of double role, where on the one hand it supports Iran to a certain extent and it sold it some of the reactors and technology, but it also was sort of like holding Iran back and then also withholding a lot of its own technology that Iran wanted, and it was playing this we're a responsible stakeholder in the the U.S.-led order and all of that. Now you can throw that all out the window. Like, that's not the situation anymore. Now Iran is almost solely, almost exclusively an asset to Russia in its broader competition, right? It's only a plus. So now Iran is supporting Russia, and there's also an expectation that Russia will now support Iran in a more clear way.
So the America pushing for, or allegedly for, Israel-Saudi Arabia deal, is that some kind of a way for America to bring back its homogeny in the Middle East?
Yeah, I would say more desperate plea to not lose it, to avoid losing it. The trend over the last decade is where the Gulf monarchies are looking around, and their major threat is Iran, right? That's like, if it not Israel, it's not anyone else. It's very clearly Iran, and that is a strategic threat to Saudi Arabia. It's not just their issues of throwing missiles at their oil refineries in the Gulf, which is definitely an issue, but long term, Iran wants to be in control of the two holy cities of Islam, right? It is the legitimate custodian of the two holy cities of Islam, and that's means Saudi Arabia can't exist, right? And so that is the major struggle in the like simple regional, right? And Iran also doesn't really want us to exist either, right?
Do you think that that'll play out at some point in the near future, like an Iran-Saudi war?
No, probably not. But this is what I want to say, that so Saudi Arabia is looking, for decades the U.S. has been its security supporter to Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arab Gulf monarchies, but the U.S. has increasingly made itself look out to look as an unreliable supporter, right? Because of a number of times. First of all, it's not supporting the Saudi Arabia's actions toward the Houthis in Yemen, and it didn't react in any significant way after the Iranian attack on Saudi oil refineries and the joint attack from the Houthis and the Iranians on other installations. And so there, over the past 10 years, save certain time under Trump, but even including Trump, because he was also very hesitant to directly counter Iranian aggression. So they've been losing their confidence in the fact that the U.S. is going to be their big reliable supporters if push comes to shove with Iran. So they're looking to hedge, right? It's hedging. It's simple hedging, meaning we're going to look for alternatives. Now, so as opposed to the Israel, Saudi Arabia is cool with whoever is willing to support them.
So, but they're going to the Chinese, who are also supporting their enemies in this war.
Yeah, but that's essentially what hedging is, especially the UAE. So they've said this. I've heard Emirati analysts say this as well very clearly. Let's say 10, 15 years ago, they were almost the most aggressive and forward-leaning against Iran, right? Ooh. And the UAE, the Emiratis. Oh, okay. And they sent forces to Algeria, to Libya. They were more gung-ho. They supported an Israeli strike on Iran. But as they realized that they can't necessarily rely on the U.S. back. They've shifted their strategy to try to minimize the threat from Iran. The Iranian threat is not going to go away, but they say we're the most exposed to it. We're just a skip and a jump across the Straits of Hormuz from Iran. So we're better off trying to restrain them and they do have diplomatic relations with them. They have ways of communicating. And they say, look, let's be a little less forward-leaning. This is in international relations term, they call this bandwagoning. You can balance or you can bandwagon, right? You can so if there's a big monster in the room, so even though it's still a threat, you try to want to appease it a little bit. And that's more or less the direction that they're doing. They want to use the Chinese to help restrain Iran.
How so?
Well, by if China becomes more of a direct supporter of Iran and signing these agreements economically and strategically, then it has more weight and influence in decision making in Tehran.
Okay.
Right, and China itself also has the same very strong interest in keeping the stability of oil and energy flowing through the Persian Gulf.
Okay.
Right, so that's a co-interest of the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the Chinese to sort of keep the Iranians, relaxed.
At bay.
Yeah.
In Hebrew, there's this expression, "Bchia ledorot." It's like weeping of generations to come.
Mm.
And I can't help but think about the invasion to Iraq. Right, because I remember I was a kid, but in Israel we rejoiced because everyone hated Saddam and the Iraqi regime, and we were deterred and afraid from them. But maybe in retrospect, it was a very bad decision, because instead of Iraq and Iran fighting with each other, killing each other, it allowed the Iranian homogeny.
Yeah, definitely. It removed the major state balancer of Iran. Yeah. Right, that was what was preventing Iran wants to create what they call a Shiite crescent, meaning a hegemony that goes from Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon out to the Mediterranean, right? And Iraq was the big obstacle in the way of its doing that. And once the U.S. toppled Saddam Hussein and turned it into sort of a rump state that doesn't have the same amount of power, then that allowed Iran to move a lot closer toward realizing that goal. On the other hand, so that's turned out not to be so great. On the other hand, retrospect at the time, I'm not too hard on you have to remember it after 9/11 what the atmosphere was in the United States. They were literally felt that they were under attack and this could happen again like next week.
Yeah.
Right. And they felt like that for a while. So there's all various theories and people would talk about Iraqi oil and other various ideas that maybe they played a role to a certain extent. But I don't think that was the main issue. I think the main issue was this was a miscalculation. At the time, Israel was saying, no, you got to go to Iran first. Iran is the major issue, right? But they didn't listen to us.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well. So do you think we'll have a deal with Saudi Arabia?
Okay, right. So this brings us back to why is the U.S. pursuing this right now? Because they realized belatedly that if the Biden administration in particular keeps on its policy of turning a cold shoulder to Saudi Arabia, saying, we don't like your domestic politics, we don't like how you weren't careful enough to avoid civilian casualties.
Dispose of journalists.
In Yemen, you're taking out journalists or, intelligence figures who also pose as journalists, go into the details of that case. But okay, it's not considered acceptable, right? So they have this big bone to pick with Saudi Arabia. And so that's not encouraging, that's just encouraging Saudi Arabia to go look for alternatives, which is China, right? So out of a belated understanding that this is the dynamic and that's what they want to change. So in the past few months, the Biden administration is doing a lot more in order to see if they could broker a deal that would lead to diplomatic relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Right. So you're saying, do I think it would happen?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it could happen. It a lot depends on whether the U.S. incentivizes, but it plays its role in a wise way. And I think that first of all, you need to the first thing to understand is that all the deals that Israel has made, all its peace agreements with all of the different regions, are first and foremost because they are in the interests of Israel and that country. right? And anytime it succeeded, it was because there was a fundamental mutual interest for both countries and understanding that this is in our interest to do it. And then the U.S. had a positive role in bringing it to the finish line, maybe incentivizing various things, adding a little bit more cards to the table. No, there's also negotiation. You add a few more cards to the table, then it allows for a few more flexibility. But it's only when it's fundamentally already started, almost already happened, and the countries were talking directly as well. This happened with Egypt, right? The Israel-Egypt peace in the 70s. First of all, it was an Israeli-Egyptian initiative, right? That then the Carter administration invited everyone to the U.S. and they made it official. Same thing with Egypt, Israel, Jordan. Right? Same thing with Abraham Accords as well. And so the same thing applies also to Saudi Arabia, meaning it is a Saudi interest to open up its cooperation with Israel beyond the under-the-table military cooperation that exists already. It is also an Israeli interest. And we could argue that it's also an American interest. But it's first of all of these things before it's anything else, and various ideas of things that are not really in our interest that the U.S. might allow to get mixed up in the bag that might mess it all up.
So give it more than 50%?
I don't know. I don't know.
Give us a
not an
headline.
issue.
Give us some,
I'll tell you, it's not an issue of percentage. It really depends on the details, right? So let's say the things that Saudi Arabia wants are well known.
Weapons.
We could point them. Yeah. So
Nuclear.
First of all, it wants some sort of formal declaration or pact or some sort of more formalized commitment of the U.S. to support its long-term security. Okay, that's again because it's first and foremost threatened by Iran, and it wants and it's the reliability of the U.S. has been undermined. It wants them to strengthen the commitment. The details are a little bit cloudy, but that's the one thing. It wants more open access and direct access to advanced American weapons. Right now, it's limited. I mean, it still buys almost all of its weapons from the U.S., but it's limited to a certain extent as to what precisely it can get, and it wants more open access to the market and better weapons, right? And third, it wants to develop its civilian nuclear technology.
Civilian.
Okay, well, it definitely wants civilian.
That's what everybody's calling it nowadays.
Right. So I mean, so you can argue that it wants the nuclear infrastructure as a hedging in the scenario where Iran gets nuclear weapons. It'll already have the basis, right? I'm sure that's also part of it. But on paper, officially, it wants a civilian nuclear infrastructure. It wants American support in doing that, right? Those are Saudi interests, right? That's what they want. One thing though that is not a Saudi interest is Israeli concessions to the PLO, to the Palestinians, right? That in no way is actually a Saudi interest. That's an ideological necessity that Saudi Arabia pays lip service to it because for the past decades it's been busy brainwashing its own population that Israel is illegitimate and it needs to support the Palestinians and all of this, right? But for over 10 years, for a while now, the Saudis themselves have recognized that this is not really in their interest to have a fully fledged Palestinian state, definitely not one that's a direct continuation of the current Palestinian state, and so but it needs to do something for the Palestinians.
Right.
So this is the most contentious maybe part of it. Oh, there's some contentious parts to the other ones, but I think the most contentious.
But contentious for the Saudis, meaning do they really care, or are they ready to sign a deal? If the United States gives them all three of the things you mentioned, do you see them saying, wait, we need something for the Palestinians?
Yeah, so what I think, my analysis is that they feel that they need to say something. They need to do something because they've put themselves into this corner, right? As also domestically, right? If they do it, they also face the issue of their own domestic politics, and they're undergoing tremendous transitions domestically in Saudi Arabia right now. So they want to sort of avoid this backlash, and they want to show their solidarity and their continuity. There's an issue of the actual king, right? We're talking about MBS, but he's just the second, and he's the de facto person in charge. But the king of Saudi Arabia, he belongs to the previous generation. He doesn't like the idea so much of normalization, and so they need to save face and show that they did something or tried to get something for the Palestinians. But between that and actual interests of what they will agree to, let's say if Israel holds its own and says, we're not making any significant concessions, not territory, we're not making long-term or permanent concessions, we're not giving away, and we're not doing anything that will limit our security, our ability to, to counter terrorism and all of that, And then what it needs to find something, some sort of bone that we can throw them, of this face-saving bone that doesn't actually cost Israel any, hardcore assets.
What?
Right?
Like we'll pass
Well, what we
money
did
to
with UAE is that we put annexation of various parts of Area C and other parts of Judea and Samaria on the table. If you remember, this was the big issue in Israel for months, preceding the announcements of the first Abraham Accords, the first trench, right? And then we said, okay, we're going to delay that. We're going to commit to not annexing various parts of Judea and Samaria for publicly they said an undefined amount of time. They might have come to maybe a certain amount of years or 2 years or something like that, right? So even
like
though
an undefined amount of time is like meaningless.
well, right. Okay, so I think behind closed doors there might have been a definition, but it wasn't a long-term one.
Okay.
Right? So they need something like that, right? That we could do. Maybe it would be
We
slightly
have an
longer amount of time.
undefined commitment. We can't say if it's a commitment.
Well, we're not going to do tomorrow. We took it off the table.
It's undefined.
We took it off the table.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? And so that was enough of a concession for the UAE to say, hey, look, they were about to do this and we stopped them by doing it, and then now we can go along. But the main issue that I want to emphasize is that right now there's a lot of fog being put out there as if, there's this expectation that if Israel wants this, it's going to have to make these big concessions, right? And what I'm saying is that's not really what's going on, and that's not really what the Saudis are going to insist on, and Israel doesn't. All Israel needs to do is hold its own and say, the very minimum. This is what we're going to do, and we're not going to do that. Do you want a deal or not?
It sounds like they don't really need to do much.
Well. Again,
Judging
so part
if
of
the UAE is a
part of this is the Biden administration, it seems, or at least the extreme left in the United States, are trying to force this issue into the negotiations when it doesn't need to be there, right? Because that's their agenda, right? It's not the majority of the Israeli public or the Israeli government. It's not the Saudis' issue. It's the Israeli and American left that really care about this issue, that are trying to conflate it with the actual story of interests that are at play here. And so this is my analysis. That's why I'm saying that Israel all it needs to do is really be clear about what are talking points and what are real interests. I want to make that a little bit clear. No Arab country actually ever really promoted the idea of a Palestinian state. They never supported it. They never wanted it. In the 50s, it was between Egypt and Syria. They both said that they should be owning this part of land. No one thought that it should be a Palestinian state, right? They had what they called the United Arab Republic. The UAR, look it up, right? That they essentially made some sort of deal that Egypt and Syria are united under a general republic, and Israel needs to go, but it's part of that. No one thought it should be a Palestinian state. Jordan, Lebanon, none of them have ever thought that was a great idea, an independent Palestinian state, right? And
because they know the Palestinians.
Right, because it will be a competitor for them too. It just doesn't make sense on so many levels, especially now that we look at the current state of the Palestinian Authority, which is a dysfunctional, corrupt, hostile, pre-state or entity.
Make Gaza look like a stable and
right.
Functioning.
Everyone knows if there was elections in the PA, Hamas would come to power, right? That's not in Saudi's interest. Saudi is against the Muslim Brotherhood, right? The UAE is against the Muslim Brotherhood. That is their second threat after the Iranian, the Shiite extreme threat, Islamism. The threat of Shiite Islamism is Sunni Islamism. That's their second threat. They don't want another Muslim Brotherhood state that can then threaten Israel, which is now an asset and a strategic asset to Saudi Arabia, right? And no one actually wants this. No, so we don't actually have to promote it. Even more so, I'll mention that recently Mahmoud Abbas traveled to China and signed also some sort of deal that it's not clear what the details are, but some sort of strategic memorandum of understanding with the CCP, right? So if there was a Palestinian state, then it would probably align itself with China and Russia politically, right? Not just trade, right? So this is definitely not it's not American interest either, right? So we need to be very clear about what needs to be done, what needs to be conceded in order to have an agreement, and what doesn't, right? And not get dragged into this. Oh, this is a wonderful thing for Israel, which it would be, as if it's more wonderful for us than it is for the other parties. Everyone has an interest in this, so everyone needs to make a deal based on that.
Yeah,
and make concessions.
So Bibi is widely credited with architecting this whole where do you put the conception, the inception of this strategy of like ignoring the Palestinians and going to the wider Arab world? Where do you put the inception of that? And was it really Bibi who kind of, or was it more pioneered it and like structured it, or was it more of just him being an opportunist and taking advantage of some moments?
Yeah, well, actually, I would put this back to the 1990s. Actually, this was in some ways the debate going on within Israel's strategic elite in the 1990s. What they were saying is that, let's say, this is just after in the context of Oslo and after signing the agreement with Jordan, everyone understood that Iraq and Iran were this long-term threat that was going to threaten Israel. And one wing in Israel felt that the peace was about to break out, right? This was Oslo. We were going to establish the PA, and then we were going to make peace with Syria, right, by withdrawing from the Golan. And then so the debate was whether we need to first of all make peace with Syria and the Palestinians, right? Because it's possible and it's just about to happen, right? So we just need to make an effort and make concessions in order to get that. And then we will create this sort of interior circle of prosperity and cooperation that will strengthen us in the next fight in the outer circle, which is Iraq and Iran. Right? This is what Rabin was thinking. This is Shimon Peres. This is what Ehud Barak was thinking. Right? And that's why Barak made such a big effort. All of them made such an effort to bend over backwards to make concessions to Palestinians and to the Syrians to try and have these peace deals. Right? Because this was out of this, what I would say is an ideological commitment that peace is possible, and that Oslo and Arafat really is desiring peace. And all we need to do is just make these territorial and other concessions in order to get there. And that'll strengthen us against the farther ones. The other wing, which was led by Netanyahu, and even though I give him great credit, it's not just Netanyahu. He's surrounded by a circle of many people both within the establishment and his closer advisors that develop this strategy and see eye to eye on this. But Netanyahu is the politician who has led this strategy. They said, no, this is the opposite. Right? Because they didn't think, even at the time of Oslo, they said, this is not leading toward peace. Arafat doesn't want peace. Right? This is just the first stage, or the next stage in their ongoing war to destroy Israel. Right? Therefore, we can't bend over backwards to make concessions here. That's not going to help us. What we need to do is concentrate on lowering the threat of terrorism, putting the brakes on Oslo as much as possible, because we're already in 1996, 1997, once Netanyahu was prime minister the first time. So Oslo was already going. Put the brakes on Oslo, deal with terrorism, but not make any concessions, not bend over backwards on that, in order to then focus on dealing with what at the time was the threat from Iraq and Iran. And this was the argument, right? And so same thing you say in the 2000s, right? So at first there was the Second Intifada, what they call, which may be more accurately called the Oslo War, right, or Oslo Terror War, because it resulted from Oslo and then the withdrawal from Lebanon in early 2000, right, under Ehud Barak. And so that was sort of intense, and they had to deal with that. But we
need to go back. I'm going to put a pin in that because I want to hear.
I want to go back to that too. Okay. Yeah, but so then you have Sharon, and again, so he's faced with this issue. Okay, in 2002, Iran was just caught with its secret, covert uranium enrichment facilities, Natanz and Arak. It's the first time, in 2000, whatever the intelligence was that was made known. That was the first time they put the Iranian Nuclear Program on the in the center, front and center of the global security, definitely Israeli security. He had that, and he had the idea of Gaza withdrawal, and he had the options of going with both, and he chose to go for Gaza withdrawal. Right, this is 2003, 2004. Right, out of this sort of and it's not that Sharon didn't think that the Iranian Nuclear Program was a threat, but he thought we need to solve this. Same thing with Olmert. Went to Annapolis, right, to try again to offer the Palestinians a state on a silver platter with half of Jerusalem and all those details. Why? Because it's not that Olmert didn't think that the Iranian Nuclear Program was a threat, but he said we can do this. And if you talk to him today, if you read his biography that he published a few years ago, he wrote a really fat biography because he had a lot of time because he was in prison for a few years, right? So he writes it in the day, right? A lot of the greatest books were written in prison. Not that his book is so great, but he tells them. He tells
I'm not sure that's a great. Yeah.
But what he says in the
other
book, though,
book written in prison was.
what he says in the book, though, is that he believes he was this close to
Maybe
having
this
a
is
deal.
what you need to finish your novel, Eitan.
Go to prison.
Yeah. So he says he believes he was this close to deal with Abbas in 2008 in Annapolis, right? It could have happened, right? Because again, it's this ideological, what I would say, belief that peace is right around the corner, right? That they're not actually, it's not just another phase in their 100-year war against the Jewish state, but it's just an issue of making things a little bit better for them, a little bit more recognition, improving the economic sphere. And then we're going to be there. So Olmert also said this is the Iran issue is an international issue. The U.S. needs to deal with it first and foremost. Everyone needs to deal with it, except for Israel doesn't need to be in the front and center of the issue, right? And then in 2009, when Netanyahu came back to power, he reversed it again. He says this is the time when Netanyahu put the Iranian issue back front and center as the primary issue of national security that Israel needs to deal with, and the Palestinian issue to an issue that needs to be managed, right? And so it was flipped back, and that's what eventually led to the Abraham Accords, meaning the consistency of Israel taking a forward-leaning and front and center issue lead, also globally lead toward the Iranian nuclear program, that made it into an asset for the UAE and Saudi Arabia against Iran, because they said, "Oh, look, Israel, they're dealing with our biggest threat." Right, so we want to support them in that, right? We want that. That's what makes Israel into an asset for the region as well, right? And definitely for the United States as well.
I see.
You want to put a pin? You put a pin on something.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting. It's like instead of staying neutral, like there's these two big giants fighting in our backyard, and instead of like staying neutral and maybe even poking around in this contentious issue that they're supposed to be paying lip service to, you're saying let's take a side of one of these giants, like let's do something that puts us on the side of one of them and gives us a strategic edge.
You're saying between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
Yeah.
I mean, right. I mean, we're obviously doing it for our own interests, first of all, because we're also threatened by Iran. But what I'm saying is when Israel takes a strong and assertive stance against its major threats, that brings it respect, and that's what turns it into a strategic asset to other partners that are looking from the sidelines, both regionally, Saudi Arabia, as well as the United States.
So we need to wrap up, but I just kind of want, I have to hear the theory of like why the Second Intifada is the consequence of Oslo and the pulling out of Lebanon.
Okay, so we really need to go back to the 80s, right? So I'd say that again, when Israel acts assertively and with clarity, and also with moral clarity about its own justification, own justice, and its own justness of its cause, that has a sort of snowball effect that leads it toward being more secure and having more power, and it brings it friends and allies. And the opposite is also true. When Israel takes withdrawals, makes tremendous concessions that threaten its own security, runs after deals and pieces of paper that say peace, even though it's not clear that the other side is interested in peace, and shows weakness and hesitancy, that brings the opposite effect. It brings upon us, it strengthens our enemies in their insistence that they really will be able to eventually end the Zionist project. So in the 80s, so around back to the first Lebanon war, there was what they called the Jibril deal, right, where Israel released some few hundreds of terrorists with blood on their hands in the context of this deal. Yeah, it was the first precedent of that, and it was mainly all of these.
Begin.
I
think.
No, it was
not
Peres.
Begin.
It was
Peres.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that sort of was one big step that then brought in PLO terrorists into Judea and Samaria, who then essentially fomented the first Intifada. Okay. The first Intifada then threatened, it became the big public issue, and that sort of made Israel...
1989.
Yeah, 1989.
They released Lebanese prisoners?
Well, they weren't Lebanese, they were Palestinians, but they were in Lebanon.
Ah, okay.
Right?
And they released
and
them...
allowed them to come into Judea and Samaria.
Ah, I see.
Right? And that was sort of like the infrastructure for the terrorism that then became the first Intifada in 1989. They brought that upon themselves. We didn't know, or like dealing with the first Intifada was a challenge. And that made, which at least politically, and maybe for a lot of some of Israel's leaders on the left, felt that, oh, look, this shows that the status quo is unsustainable and we can't stay in control of Judea and Samaria and we have to make some sort of process. And this was the impetus for the Oslo process. We're saying we're going to bring in the PA, we're going to bring the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
From Tunisia.
Because they were in exile in Tunisia, right? Because we had up until now said the PLO is illegitimate. It's an illegitimate terrorist group. It doesn't represent the Arabs that live in Judea and Samaria. And we're not going to talk to them because they want to kill us, right? It's noteworthy. When was the PLO founded?
64.
Yeah, right. What do they want to they want to liberate Palestine? They want to liberate from where? From what territory?
Jordan.
Right? No, from Israel proper. Right? Where did Israel control Judea and Samaria in 1964? No, but they wanted to liberate Palestine because they want to liberate it of Jews of Israel proper. It doesn't matter any borders. Right, so they brought that all in. That led to the first Intifada. The first Intifada made some part of the Israeli political echelon overly zealous to come to some sort of agreement to pass on the control of the place, and this is where the impetus for Oslo came. Okay, Oslo, and in that context, and the belief that a few more steps and we have peace, led also Ehud Barak to say we need to withdraw from Lebanon. Ehud Barak comes to power in 1999. He says, I'm going to do two things within a year. I'm going to get peace with Palestinians. I'm going to get us out of the security zone in southern Lebanon.
That was his campaign, to be fair. That was his campaign when he ran.
He did run on that. This was, by the way, against the recommendations of the IDF at the time. The IDF said, okay, there was a problem. There was the incident with the helicopter and a number. There was a price to be paid for staying in Lebanon. But overall, my claim is that the idea that Israel couldn't have stayed there and it couldn't have stayed in the security zone in southern Lebanon and it was unsustainable. I think that's an ideological claim, right? That's Ehud Barak's view. It's not an absolute. It's not absolutely true. We could have stayed there, and it was Ehud Barak's insistence that we must leave in order to come to some sort of deal with Syria, essentially forced him or brought him to do it. Okay, so the withdrawal so we had both Oslo and so that sort of sent the message to the PLO, which is still committed to Israel's destruction, that Israel is hesitant and weak and it wants out. The withdrawal from southern Lebanon strengthened Hezbollah. Right, Hezbollah said, "Oh, look, we're winning. Look, our strategy of attacking of Atasha, forgot the word. Attrition for 15 years. It's worked. We defeated the great IDF, and they went running overnight away from our territory back to Israel. We are winning, right? So this strengthened Hezbollah. That led to Nasrallah's famous speech where he said that Israel is like a spider's web, right? It's just touched it a little bit and it's all going to fall apart, right? So this, all of this together led to what eventually became the Second Intifada. Right, we're saying, okay, we just need to push a little bit more. This strengthened Arafat, this strengthened Hezbollah, and they said we just need to push a little bit more, and Israel is going to fall apart. And so we need to now double down on our attacks on Israelis in what they call the Second Intifada. Right,
the Second Lebanon War, if you want to stretch it a few years later.
I would then add that let's say after the Second Intifada, that we had Chomat Magen, the Operation Protective Wall, I think.
Whatever.
All right, whatever. We went into the Judea and Samaria. Israel retook control of certain areas. It dismantled the terrorist infrastructure that had been built there for 15 years. And that was a serious blow to the PA and its terrorist capabilities. But immediately after that, what did we do? Withdrawal from Gaza. Right? And it was with withdrawal from Gaza that demoralized both their, I think, overall society and the IDF and encouraged Hezbollah, saying, "Oh, look, that's what they left Gaza right now because they feel like they can't handle it and they can't stick it out. Then let's attack them now. Let's do that." And of course, that was a miscalculation, but that's what led them to think that way. And so this has had its own snowball effects, and until again around 2009, where we started turning it around, right, where Israel took the lead globally on against the Iranian nuclear program. It put the brakes on concessions and stopped running after Abbas to try and make concessions to offer the Palestinians a sovereign state, and it made it clear that it is going to seek its own security and act when it needs to act.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah, right. I just want to make that point there, and that's what led to there's a particular issue in 2015, right, where Netanyahu goes to Washington to lecture or to speak in the U.S. Congress. And this was a big controversial issue. He was, of course, invited there by Congress, but, it was against what the president was trying to lead, which was the Iran deal, right? And so it's been said afterward by Saudi Arabia and Emirati sources that it was when they saw that Netanyahu was willing to do that he was willing to put his neck out in order to undermine the deal that they also saw as a negative deal, because it also threatened their future, their security. That was when they realized it's worth taking extra steps in order to have normalization with Israel.
He was willing to go to bat against the biggest player on the field.
Right, exactly. He said if Israel's willing to do that, then that's someone we want on our team.
So maybe short answer. Do you think? Obviously, some say that Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, now they see weakness in Israel, in the IDF. We're under a huge campaign, like propaganda campaign here in Israeli media, in Israeli news outlets. It basically says the IDF is doomed, the Air Force is dismantling. So our enemies see it as an opportunity. Mm-hmm. Do you think it's rightfully so on their part?
We need to separate between the actual state of affairs, which I don't think that the IDF is really about to fall apart or anything of the sort. But Israel has taken certain actions to encourage Hezbollah, like the maritime deal that it signed a year ago, right? For over a decade or for a long time, we had a dispute with Lebanon over where exactly the maritime border lies, right? And it was under ongoing negotiations. Hezbollah sends a drone close to the oil rigs and to sort of threaten that it might do something. And all of a sudden, the U.S. is pressuring the interim Israeli government to make concessions and give away large parts of the oil that is underneath the Mediterranean there to Lebanon, which is essentially under Hezbollah control, right? So that was very encouraging to Hezbollah, right? And then from there, we've seen another of steps from Hezbollah that show that our deterrence toward them has been undermined.
Including, you think, the events of the last 6 months here in Israel?
Yeah, it's, on the northern border. I mean that what Hezbollah, it put tents in Israeli territory and sort of established a foothold.
But the real situation of the IDF doesn't matter. What matters is that it
does matter when push comes to shove.
Yeah, but it can still lead us to another miscalculation.
Right, yeah. We can undermine deterrence while we still actually do have the power to act. Which would be a mistake. I would then promote that we stop making concessions to Hezbollah. Maybe we even take decisive action against its provocations on the northern border. Right? And not worry that this might lead to war, because it's quite the opposite. When Israel acts with decisive power, that's what deters our enemies. And when Israel shows hesitancy and that it's afraid of having an altercation, then that's what encourages its enemies.
Okay, so you have a book coming out. Let's plug it. When is it coming out?
October.
In English?
Yes.
So let's plug it.
Well, it's called Cultures of Counterproliferation, The Making of Israeli and American Policy Toward the Iranian Nuclear Program, by the academic press Routledge. And I have another of other articles, proper academic articles that I've described some of the things that we spoke about here, and a number of other op-eds published in various English and Hebrew platforms.
And your social media?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and Facebook. I'm not big into social media. I'm more focused on my programs that I run, my lectures, writing more in-depth research. But I do have a presence there. But searching my name in English or Hebrew will bring you to various material that I have out there.
Dr. Raphael BenLevi, and the Ben and Levi are connected.
One word.
Yeah.
One word.
Okay.
And Raphael with PH, not with F.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming.
You.
It was really
thank you very much.
Interesting, fascinating.
Yeah, thanks guys for having me. It was great talking to you.
Thanks.
Till
See you in the next
time.
one, guys.
Bye.
Bye.